sometimes if you're trying to cover an area, but in general I like the textures and the dry brush effect, so that's why I do that. On to the background lamb now, background sheep. Keeping things fairly simple with this one because it's off in the distance, so really just blocking in the area of shadow and also just correcting the outline of the back a little bit, but taking some care with the directions of my brush strokes though, so I did drag the brush in the direction that the wool was falling on that sheep. But a simple blocking in of the silhouette of the lamb that's grazing. Made that rear leg too long, so I just took off a little bit of paint with my finger there. And so by introducing the tone, the darker tones, on the foreground animals and keeping the background animals, the shadows rather paler, we're maintaining and slightly enhancing that sense of depth that we talked about before. So we get a sense of depth, as mentioned previously, with the differences in strengths of colour and tone on the field in the foreground compared to the distant field and the distant trees. And similarly, the darker shadows on the foreground animals help to bring them forward from both the background and the distant animals. Now I've switched to a small round brush now, and I'm applying a colour similar to the one I used with the sky. I think this is actually a mix of titanium white and cobalt blue now. And I'm picking out some of the mid-tones on those two background animals. So again, keeping things simple, keeping with the Impressionism style, patches of light and dark. So I'm simply painting the shapes of colour or light that I see. And you can see I think that's worked quite effectively on that background sheep. That's looking quite three-dimensional now. So, similar treatment on the left-hand lamb. I try to stay working with as large a brush as possible for as long as possible. But when the animal I'm painting is as small as the one that I'm working on now, it's difficult to do with a brush much bigger than the little round brush I'm using. So that's why I've switched to the smaller brush. And you can see I'm using some titanium white now to pick out some highlights on that foreground lamb as well on the left here. So in the same way that the shadows with the foreground animals will generally be darker than the shadows on the background animals, the same is true of the highlights, except of course the highlights will be lighter and brighter in general. So I'm just putting some highlights in on that background sheet though. And I'm still keeping and persisting with this patchwork of colours, patchwork of little blocks of light. So the addition of the light there started to lift that background sheep out from the background trees. Coming in now with a pinkier, or a light pink, I guess, and back to the larger brush. So as soon as I was able to do so, I've switched back to that larger brush now. Now for these foreground animals, the first sheep that I drew, the one that's staring right at you, left of centre, I want those animals in that little group to be the main focus of this painting. So although the sheep that I'm working on now, the big fluffy one bottom right, is arguably closer to the viewer, I'm going to keep that sheep and the lamb next to it less detailed and less defined than the sheep to the left, because I want them to sort of have a little bit of an out of focus feel, so that perhaps you might not even notice that right hand sheep for a fraction of a second when you first look at the painting, because your eye is going to be drawn towards the main focus over on the left hand half of the painting. So that's really one of the the fun things to play around with when you're working away, is to where are the boundaries between the animal and the field and the distant trees? Do you want a very distinct boundary so that that animal shows up and pops out of the background, or do you want a less defined boundary so that it's almost in camouflage, even if it's not really that way in real life? Do you want to kind of leave layers and other things for people to discover when they look at the painting? Now, this little lamb I'm working on at the moment, putting in the pink highlights again, if you look where I placed the shadow on the body, and again where I'm putting the highlight paint now on top of the back, you can see that my original blue watercolour marker lines made the animal's body too long. It wasn't foreshortened enough. And I intend to leave those blue lines in. And I quite like doing that in much of my work, so people can see how I've created the image. So we're gradually working our way around the entire picture, bringing up the whole painting to to the same level of finish. And so with that in mind, I've now gone over to the main sheet, and I'm putting in some of that pink colour, overlaying that over some of the unpainted regions of paper, but also over some of the shadow areas as well, building up the layers gradually. So we're getting a mixing of colour not only on the palette, where you might mix a white and the red to make the pink, but also some optical mixing where you've got a layer of the burnt umber showing through a layer of the pale pink. So we've got 3 of the animals covered with a layer of pink. Now it's time for the 4th one. So we'll bring up all of those main 4 foreground animals. I've now got a nice pink overlay. So having done that, now it's time to introduce some highlights. So I'm using a light blue here. And because the surface of the face of that sheep in the bottom right hand corner is smooth compared to the surface of the wool, I've patched in the face with a solid area of colour, but I'm using rather a lighter touch to give a more textured finish on the wool. So this painting really is a little bit of a callback to